The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked alongside his grandfather, King Charles III. The young prince had grown considerably over the past year, his shoulders broader, his stride more confident, yet there remained something wonderfully innocent about the way he observed the world around him. Today was different from their usual walks. The king had specifically requested this private moment with his eldest grandchild, away from the cameras, away from the protocols that usually governed every royal movement. Charles wanted to share something important with George, something that would help the boy understand the weight of the crown that would one day rest upon his head. As they approached the East Terrace, where a small gathering of royal guards stood at attention, George noticed something that made his steps slow. Among the guards, one figure stood slightly apart from the others. Sergeant David Morrison, a decorated veteran who had served the royal family for over 15 years, maintained his rigid posture, but George's keen eyes caught something others might miss. The sergeant's hands trembled almost imperceptibly. His breathing seemed labored, and though he tried to hide it, beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cool morning air. George had seen this before, though he couldn't quite place where. Something deep in his memory stirred, a recognition that made his chest tighten with concern. King Charles continued speaking about duty and service, his words flowing over the morning air like a gentle stream. He spoke of the guards who protected them, men and women who dedicated their lives to something greater than themselves. But George's attention had shifted entirely to Sergeant Morrison. The young prince remembered now. Last summer, during a family gathering, he had witnessed his great-uncle struggle with similar symptoms. The adults had whispered words like episode and overwhelming, and George had watched as the man he admired needed to step away, to find quiet, to breathe. The memory was vivid now, along with the understanding that sometimes even the strongest people needed help. Sergeant Morrison's condition was becoming more apparent. His rigid military bearing began to waver slightly, and George could see the internal struggle the man was fighting. The sergeant was clearly experiencing some form of distress, possibly a panic attack or an overwhelming moment brought on by stress or health issues, but his training and dedication kept him rooted in place. George's mind raced. He understood the protocols, the expectations, the way things were supposed to work. Guards stood at attention. Royals walked past. Everyone played their part in the great theater of monarchy. But something deeper than protocol stirred within the young prince, something that spoke to the very heart of what leadership truly meant. The king continued his gentle lecture, unaware of the drama unfolding just meters away. Charles spoke of tradition, of the unbroken chain of service that connected past to present, of the responsibility that came with privilege. His words were important, meant to shape George's understanding of his future role, but the boy was receiving a different kind of education entirely. George watched as Sergeant Morrison's struggle intensified. The man's jaw was clenched tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but George could see the war being fought beneath the surface. The sergeant was a proud man, a professional who would rather collapse than abandon his post. It was exactly this kind of dedication that the king was describing, this selfless service that formed the backbone of the monarchy. But George saw something else. He saw a human being in distress, someone who needed compassion more than he needed to maintain appearances. The young prince felt a clarity that surprised him with its intensity. This wasn't about breaking protocol or causing a scene. This was about recognizing when tradition needed to bend to accommodate human need. The decision formed in George's mind with startling swiftness. He knew what needed to happen, and he understood that it would require him to act with a maturity beyond his years. The guards couldn't see Morrison's distress, or if they could, they were bound by the same rigid protocols that kept Morrison at his post. Someone needed to break the cycle, to provide a graceful exit that would preserve everyone's dignity. George's heart pounded as he prepared to act. He thought about his parents, Prince William and Princess Catherine, and how they had always taught him that true nobility came from serving others, not from being served. He thought about his great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and the stories of her kindness that went unreported by the press. He thought about what kind of king he wanted to be someday, and what kind of man he wanted to be right now. The king's voice continued, a steady cadence of wisdom and instruction, but George's focus had narrowed to this single moment of choice. He could continue walking, pretend not to notice, allow Sergeant Morrison to suffer in silence while maintaining the illusion of perfect order. Or he could step forward, accept responsibility for what happened next, and show that leadership sometimes meant disrupting the expected flow of events. As they drew closer to the group of guards, George made his choice. He would act, but he would do so in a way that honored everyone involved. The sergeant's pride, the guard's professionalism, his grandfather's teachings, and his own growing understanding of what it meant to lead with compassion. The morning air seemed to hold its breath as George prepared to step outside the comfortable boundaries of protocol and into the uncertain territory of authentic leadership. He was about to learn that sometimes the most impactful moves were the quietest ones, and that true strength was often found in the gentlest gestures. Morrison's distress was reaching a critical point, and George knew that in the next few moments, he would either witness a proud man's private struggle become a public ordeal, or he would find a way to change the course of events entirely. The choice was his, and for the first time in his young life, Prince George felt the full weight of what it meant to have power and the responsibility to use it wisely. Prince George's decision crystallized into action with the kind of natural grace that seemed to surprise even himself. As King Charles continued his thoughtful discourse on royal responsibility, George gently touched his grandfather's arm, a gesture so subtle it appeared almost accidental. "Grandfather," George said quietly, his voice carrying just enough concern to capture the king's attention without alarming anyone else nearby. "I think I dropped something back there. Could we perhaps stop for a moment?" King Charles paused, following his grandson's gaze toward the area where Sergeant Morrison stood with the other guards. The king's experienced eyes immediately assessed the situation, though he couldn't immediately identify what had caught George's attention. The boy's request was unusual but not unprecedented, and Charles had learned over his many decades of royal service that sometimes the smallest interruptions could prevent larger disruptions. "Of course, my boy," the king replied, his tone warm and accommodating. "What exactly did you drop?" George's mind worked quickly. He needed to create a reason to approach the guards, something that would seem natural and give Morrison the opportunity to step away without appearing to abandon his post. The young prince remembered a technique his mother had taught him about helping others save face when they needed assistance. "My pen," George said, patting his jacket pocket with just enough confusion to seem genuine. "The one you gave me for my birthday. I think it might have fallen when I was writing in my notebook earlier." This was brilliant in its simplicity. The pen was indeed a gift from the king, making it valuable enough to warrant stopping their walk. Moreover, George had been carrying a small notebook where he occasionally jotted down interesting things from their conversations, a habit that delighted his grandfather and made the lost pen story entirely believable. King Charles smiled at his grandson's apparent distress over the missing pen. "Well, we certainly can't leave that behind, can we? Let's retrace our steps and see if we can find it." As they turned back toward the guards, George caught Morrison's eye for just a moment. The sergeant's distress was now clearly visible to anyone looking closely, his face pale and his breathing shallow. But protocol demanded he remain at his post unless specifically dismissed or unless an emergency was declared, neither of which seemed likely to happen. George approached the situation with the instinctive diplomacy that seemed woven into his DNA. Instead of directly addressing Morrison's distress, which would have embarrassed the proud sergeant, the young prince created an opportunity for everyone to act with dignity. "Excuse me," George said, addressing the group of guards in general, but positioning himself so that Morrison was directly in his line of sight. "I seem to have lost something rather important, and I wonder if any of you might have seen it. A silver pen, about this size, with my initials engraved on it." The guards immediately snapped to even more rigid attention, honored to be addressed directly by the future king. This was exactly what George had hoped for. Their focus would shift from maintaining formation to assisting with his request, creating natural movement and conversation that would break the static tension of the formal arrangement. "We'd be happy to help you look, Your Royal Highness," came the immediate response from the guard captain, though his eyes quickly scanned the immediate area where they stood. George nodded gratefully, then seemed to have a sudden inspiration. "Actually, Sergeant Morrison, I remember now. I was writing something down when we passed by this area earlier, and you were standing just about there." He pointed to a spot several meters away, near a bench that sat in the shade of a large oak tree. "Would you mind helping me search around there? I have a feeling it might have rolled in that direction." The brilliance of this request was immediately apparent to everyone involved, though perhaps only Morrison fully understood its true purpose. George had given the sergeant a direct order, not a suggestion or a request, but a clear instruction that provided complete justification for leaving his post. Moreover, he had done so in a way that positioned Morrison as helpful rather than needy, as someone whose assistance was specifically required rather than someone who needed assistance. Morrison's relief was carefully controlled but unmistakable. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. I'd be honored to assist you." As Morrison stepped away from the formation and walked toward the bench, George could see the tension beginning to leave the man's shoulders. The sergeant was now following a direct order from a member of the royal family, which meant he could focus on recovering from his distress without any question about his dedication or professionalism. King Charles watched this interaction with growing interest, beginning to understand that his grandson's lost pen might be less about a missing object and more about a found opportunity to help someone. The king's respect for George's instinctive leadership deepened as he observed how naturally the boy had created a solution that honored everyone involved. "Let's spread out a bit," George suggested to the remaining guards. "It's a small pen, so it could be anywhere around here." This instruction served multiple purposes. It broke up the formal formation, created a more relaxed atmosphere, and ensured that Morrison would have some space and privacy as he collected himself near the bench. As the guards began their search, George walked over to where Morrison stood, ostensibly looking for the pen, but actually creating an opportunity for private conversation. The sergeant was taking deep breaths, his color slowly returning to normal as the immediate crisis passed. "Sergeant Morrison," George said quietly, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed remarkable for someone his age. "I hope you're feeling better now." Morrison's eyes widened slightly, understanding fully for the first time that the young prince had orchestrated this entire scene for his benefit. The realization was both humbling and deeply moving. In all his years of service, he had never experienced such thoughtful leadership from someone so young. "Your Royal Highness," Morrison began, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you." George smiled, the expression both wise and innocent. "My parents always tell me that taking care of each other is the most important job any of us have. Everything else is just details." The sergeant nodded, feeling stronger by the moment. The panic attack or whatever had been overwhelming him was now manageable, and he had been given the gift of recovering his composure without losing his dignity. George had somehow understood exactly what was needed and had provided it with a grace that spoke to his natural leadership abilities. "I think," George said thoughtfully, that we should probably look for this pen for a few more minutes, just to be thorough. Then, when we head back to join the others, you'll be feeling completely ready to return to your duties." Morrison understood perfectly. George was giving him time, space, and a dignified path back to his responsibilities. The young prince had seen a problem, created a solution, and implemented it without fanfare or self-congratulation. It was leadership at its finest, quiet and effective and deeply compassionate. As they continued their careful search for the fictional pen, Morrison felt his strength returning completely. The crisis had passed, thanks to the intervention of a 10-year-old boy who had somehow possessed the wisdom and courage to break protocol in service of human kindness. After several minutes of searching, during which Morrison had fully recovered his composure and the other guards had relaxed into a more natural rhythm, George made a show of checking his jacket pockets one final time. His face brightened with apparent relief and mild embarrassment. "Oh, my goodness," he exclaimed, pulling the silver pen from an inner pocket where it had been safely stored all along. "Here it is. I must have put it in a different pocket than usual. How silly of me." The guards smiled at this very human moment from their future king, appreciating both his apparent absent-mindedness and his genuine gratitude for their help. Morrison, now fully recovered and standing straight with renewed confidence, stepped forward with the others as they prepared to resume their formal positions. "Thank you all so much for your help," George said warmly, making eye contact with each guard individually. "I really appreciate you taking the time to look for it. This pen means a great deal to me." King Charles observed this entire exchange with a mixture of pride and curiosity. Something about the way his grandson had handled the situation suggested there was more to the story than a simple case of a misplaced pen. The king had spent decades reading people and situations, and George's behavior had the hallmarks of purposeful action rather than accident. As they resumed their walk, leaving the guards to return to their duties, Charles waited until they were well out of earshot before addressing his observations. "That was interesting, George," the king said thoughtfully. "I noticed you seemed particularly concerned about that pen, and particularly focused on Sergeant Morrison's assistance in finding it." George walked quietly for a moment, considering how to respond. He had acted on instinct and compassion, but he was still young enough to worry about whether he had overstepped bounds or misunderstood a situation. The weight of his grandfather's attention made him want to explain himself carefully. "I noticed that Sergeant Morrison seemed unwell, grandfather," George said finally, his honesty simple and direct. "He was trying very hard not to show it, but I could tell he was struggling with something. I remembered when Great-Uncle Andrew had those difficult moments last summer, and I thought maybe the sergeant needed a chance to step away for a moment without anyone thinking less of him." King Charles stopped walking, turning to face his grandson with an expression of profound respect and affection. The depth of George's observation and the sophistication of his solution were remarkable enough. But what truly moved the king was the underlying compassion that had motivated the boy's actions. "And the pen was never actually lost, was it?" Charles asked gently. George shook his head, looking slightly sheepish. "I'm sorry for the deception, grandfather. I just couldn't think of another way to help him that wouldn't embarrass him or make him feel like he was failing in his duties." The king's smile was radiant with pride. "My dear boy, you have nothing to apologize for. What you did today was exactly what a good leader should do. You saw someone in need, you found a way to help them while preserving their dignity, and you did it all without seeking recognition or praise for yourself." They resumed walking, but the atmosphere between them had shifted. The morning's lesson about duty and service had taken on a much more personal and powerful dimension than Charles had originally planned. "You know," the king continued, "I've been monarch for several years now, and I've served in various royal capacities for decades before that. I've seen many examples of leadership, both good and poor. What you demonstrated today ranks among the finest examples I've ever witnessed." George felt a warm flush of pride, but also a growing understanding of the responsibility that came with his position. "I just thought about what Mummy and Papa always tell me, about how we're supposed to help people, especially when we have the ability to make things better." "Exactly right," Charles affirmed. "And you chose to act on that principle even when it required you to take a risk, to step outside normal protocols, to trust your own judgment about what was right in the moment." As they walked, both grandfather and grandson reflected on what had transpired. For George, it was a moment of recognition that the abstract concepts of leadership and service could translate into concrete actions with real impact on real people. For King Charles, it was a glimpse of the kind of monarch his grandson might become, someone who understood that true authority came from serving others rather than being served by them. "What you did for Sergeant Morrison today will likely remain with him for the rest of his career," the king observed. "Not because a prince helped him, but because someone saw his need and responded with such thoughtfulness and grace. That kind of leadership creates loyalty that goes far deeper than mere protocol or tradition." George nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think he knew what I was doing?" "Oh, I'm quite certain he understood completely," Charles replied with a chuckle. "Sergeant Morrison is an intelligent man with many years of experience reading situations and people. He knew exactly what you were offering him, and I suspect he was deeply moved by your discretion and kindness." As they neared the castle, George felt a new sense of confidence about his future role. The morning had started with his grandfather's planned lesson about royal duty, but it had evolved into something much more personal and meaningful. George had discovered that he possessed instincts and abilities that would serve him well as a leader, and more importantly, that he could trust those instincts even when they led him into uncharted territory. "Grandfather," George said as they approached the castle entrance, "I hope I'll always remember to look for the people who might need help, even when they're trying very hard not to show it." King Charles placed a gentle hand on his grandson's shoulder, feeling the weight of history and hope in that simple gesture. "I believe you will, George. And I believe that quality will make you not just a good king someday, but a good man always." The morning's walk was ending, but its lessons would last a lifetime. Prince George had taken a significant step toward understanding what true leadership meant, and Sergeant Morrison had experienced the kind of compassionate authority that would inspire him to serve with even greater dedication. Most importantly, a small act of kindness had rippled outward, creating connections and understanding that would influence both men for years to come. As they entered the castle, George was already looking forward to his next opportunity to put these lessons into practice, knowing now that leadership wasn't about grand gestures or formal proclamations, but about quiet moments of human connection and the courage to act when action was needed. The silent move he had made that morning would echo through his life, shaping the kind of leader he would become and the kind of impact he would have on the lives of those who served alongside him.